Hello, welcome to the Rippling Pages with me, Liam Bishop, curating the best writers to inspire you and your writing. Today, I'm with Benjamin Markovits to discuss his new novel, The Rest of Our Lives, published by Faber and Faber. Now, Tom Layward has made a pact with himself. After his daughter moves out of college, he's moving out too. His wife had an affair and he feels like he owes himself a road trip across America. He takes in the sights, sounds, and basketball games of the American heartland and beyond. But he's deferring addressing some health issues, and it seems like it's only a matter of time before his body asks him to stop and slow down. It's a bittersweet story of a journey, both literal and metaphorical, as well as touching on themes readers of Benjamin will know he's touched on before: family, love, loneliness, and yes, of course, basketball. This is Benjamin's 12th novel. His novel, You Don't Have to Live Like This, won the James Tait Black Prize for fiction. He's one of Granta's best of young British novelists, and his writing has featured prolifically in all the best publications, newspapers in the English language. Benjamin, I am delighted to have you on the Rippling Pages. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Just before we get going, remember to share, follow, subscribe to the Rippling Pages. Tell your friends about it if you enjoy the show. And of course, feel free to leave a review as well on your favorite podcast provider. Where is it you're dialing in from today?
So North London, which is where I've lived for the past 25 years.
Okay, but yeah, you grew up in Texas and a bit of Germany, I think, as well.
So I was born in California, grew up mostly in Austin, Texas, but my mother is German and my dad is from New York, and they were both academics. So I'm an academy brat. They dragged us around the world on all their sabbaticals, which explains.
Right, okay. I mean, that contrasts me and my kind of very boring upbringing in Leeds, in West
Always
Yorkshire.
lead.
It's a nice city though. It's growing bigger.
I'd like to go. I'd like to go.
We'll get into it, Ben. We've got an idea there in the introduction of what's going on in the novel, but there's a moment where Tom describes his marriage as a C minus marriage, and then he says this makes it pretty hard to score much higher than a B overall in the rest of your life. Quite a typical line of this character, Tom. But clearly he has some kind of belief system in marriage. I wondered, why did he set off on this journey and why now?
So it's true that he made a kind of deal with himself when his wife had the affair. It wasn't like a real contract. It was just something he told himself as he was dealing with the aftermath and trying to cope with his feelings of betrayal and jealousy. That, like, okay, you've got to stick it out for the kids, but when the kids leave home, you can reconsider. But that was, I'm trying to work out, over 10 years ago. And so when he drops his younger child, his daughter, at university, it's not like he set out thinking, as soon as she's gone, I'm taking off. But he'd had it in the back of his mind. That line about the C minus marriage, I mean, part of what I wanted to get at, he has come up through the American university system. He's a law professor, and he's spent his life thinking in terms of grades and how you measure up on some kind of objective scale. And it's not that he says it happily. He just has the feeling that if your wife cheated on you and you're still battling it out 10 years later, you're probably not in the best marriage in the world. And if your marriage isn't good, then it's probably a pretty good bet that your life isn't terrific either. And as somebody who's always wanted to do well at things, that seems like a mark of failure. But part of the point of the novel is to get him to realize that's maybe the wrong way of looking at these things.
Yeah, I was wondering throughout, really, does Tom believe he's a failure, but is he actually a failure?
I guess the people I like to write about, I would describe as moderately successful failures. And I don't know to what extent it has to do with, I mean, there's a little bit of basketball in the book, less than in previous novels. It's more kind of hobby or sideline in the novel. But one of the things about playing sports, I don't know, did you play any sports as a kid?
Yeah, I know the feeling of failure. That's for sure. I used to play a lot of cricket, which there's a lot of failure in cricket.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's common in any sport. But yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
mean, I think I just projected onto you there, Benjamin. Actually, I think you didn't even ask me, do I feel like a failure? I think I immediately said it. But
so I once played in a Village 11. An editor I knew had a kind of club game that he played at the weekends, and he invited me along. And I think I batted something like 9th or 10th. And I waited around in the pavilion all afternoon, came out to face a ball, didn't see the ball. It was going much too fast for me. Nothing happened. Faced the second ball, didn't see that one either. The wicketkeeper called out, "How's that?" as if I had nicked it, which I don't think I had. I have no idea if I nicked it or not. I don't think I even played a stroke. And the umpire, who was my friend, decided that he could trust the wicketkeeper, even though he hadn't heard anything. Called me out. That was it. I trudged back to the pavilion. That was my day. And I thought, this is not for me. I love listening to it. I like watching it. But the good thing about basketball is if you miss a shot, you get another shot.
So Tom, then he's interested in basketball, but these narrators then and all these characters that, well, not all the characters you write about, but I mean, is the sportsman the way in then to that kind of mindset?
I think it's one of them. I mean, the reason I brought up the sports is because my sense of playing sports is that you keep going until it turns out you're not good enough. And when you play sports, that's brought home to you in a really obvious way. Whereas in the rest of our life, you can do a lot of jobs and it's never quite made clear to you that you're not hacking it. And so that just seems like an interesting model for understanding what it means to try to get better at something, that you keep going until you suck.
So we see that he's trying to write, well, he wants to write a book about basketball, pick up basketball. You know, it's this big kind of road trip, but it's not a big novel. It's just over 200 pages. So we don't see, you know, we know that he wants to, his wife's had an affair and he wants to leave his wife or go on this journey for sure. But there's kind of all this psychological backing to Tom, but we go in and this is all kind of context, isn't it, to some extent?
Yeah.
I guess it's a question of choice. What details did you put in to see Tom as this person?
That's interesting. So I wrote the first 2 pages long before I started the novel. I think I'd been reading something or working on something else. And for whatever reason, the opening lines occurred to me and I sat down and wrote to see where they would take me. And the core of it really is that his wife had an affair. He has this feeling about himself that he hasn't ended up where he thought he might be at the age of 50 something. I think that I'm worried that just describing him that like that make him seem more blokish than he really is. In fact, what he spends much of the book doing is trying to think about his marriage and think about why his wife would have done what she did. And he's full of sympathy for her. He just has this sense in, I don't know what you'd call 55. Let's call it middle age, or maybe even late-ish middle age. I don't know where the boundaries are. He has a sense that you reach a point in your life when you're no longer expecting change. You're just kind of hanging on to whatever life you've made for yourself. And I think that's hard to live with, because I think what animates people and keeps them going when they're younger is their sense of possibility. And to some degree, when you get married and have kids, you're trying to close down possibilities. You're trying to present to your family this idea that you have reached a point of stasis. And that's hard to live with, especially when the kids leave home. So my way into his character, I suppose, was this sense he wanted to reclaim of somebody whose life was still up for grabs.
So how then does that differ from some of, because there are things in Tom that people might recognize in some of your other narrators, but how does this differ then? Is it his age or is it his belief system?
Yeah, I think he's a little older. Brian Bloom, the narrator of my previous novel, The Sidekick, was more like his mid-30s, late 30s. And that's a different kind of pressure that's put to bear on you, right, when you're in your 30s. I think like a lot of my narrators, I've written third-person novels too. He thinks of himself as reasonable. And to some extent, I think he is reasonable. And part of the point of what happens to him is to show the limits of reasonableness. I'm not sure you can totally get by just on being reasonable.
Reasonable in the sense of,
yeah, you do things that make sense to you. You try to be decent to people. You try to be nice. You try not to cause harm. You try to be patient. You try to act selfishly only when you think you're entitled to it. You try not to claim things that aren't yours. You try to live an orderly life. You try to be, the good student who does what teacher says, does his homework, prepares for tests. And the hope is that if you do all these things, you're not only get the good grades, but you get the good life. And part of what he's dealing with is the sense that he did all those things and it didn't give him the life he wanted.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And you said before you don't want to make him sound blokish, and it definitely isn't that. He's not the kind, there's some things in here that might, or the way I sort of presented it to you, might make you think of, some of the novels by sort of Roth and Updike, but it is very tender. It is very, bittersweet. It has there's a real fragility, I think, to Tom that really, to me as a reader anyway, and I don't know if that's what you wanted to convey, but there's a fragility to him.
Yeah, and I mean, I love Roth and Updike, and I've loved reading them. I guess I felt like there were character types that they weren't interested enough in, especially Roth. I mean, Roth says it's somewhere that niceness is even worse in writers than it is in other people. I kind of like niceness. I don't think it should be undervalued. And I think a lot of people spend a lot of their time trying to be nice, and that Roth's lack of interest in it shows up in the fiction in ways that maybe creates more chaos, which he liked, but it ruled out whole swathes of life in which people are trying to do their best and still struggling. And so I think Tom tries to be nice most of the time, and it gets him a certain distance. One of the things he's wrestling with, he has this idea of writing a book about playing pickup basketball in America. And the truth is, that's another one of those deals he makes with himself that he's almost embarrassed to have to follow through on, because it's an idea he had when he was dropping out of grad school. He thought, I don't want to sit around in grad school writing about other people. I want to write my own books. But the truth is, he actually didn't really want to write his own books. He actually just wanted to sit around reading people's books and having a nice time. And part of what he's wrestling with is that maybe there was some failure of ambition in him earlier on. Even though he lives a successful life, he's a law professor, he lives in New York, he makes decent money, that it might be too late to address that failure of ambition. But on some level, he doesn't want to give up on it.
Can you explain the significance of it being pickup basketball?
Yeah. So I guess they're pickup football. I mean, do you play pickup cricket? It's a little harder.
No, I'm trying to think of an analogy for listeners, but I think there's something quite pertinent within the fact that it's pickup basketball.
Yeah.
Street cricket, five-a-side football, an accessible way to play a game, maybe a street version of the sport, is it? Or
It's a street version. I spent a lot of my childhood and 20s playing pickup basketball. It's really kind of a wonderful thing. You just show up at a court, and each court has its own little mini culture of rules, but there's a lot of common ground from one court in America to another. And you figure out who's got next, which means whoever is waiting to get in the game, who gets to pick the next team that goes in. When one team loses, they have to go off the court, and whoever has next gets to pick the team that goes on next. And it's basically just a way into America for Tom. You meet accountants after work who used to play high school ball, trying to get a runaround before they go home to their kids. You meet medical orderlies from the local hospital, or high school kids after school trying to practice their skills against a bunch of old timers. You meet out of work guys who hang around the park all day and dream of their glory years in the past. They all come together, and there's this culture and code that allows you to interact in these really satisfying ways. And then you can see if you can play or not, if you're good enough, if the shots go in, if things go your way. Tom's idea is to write a book about playing pickup basketball across the country. Like, I used to play in a court near the Met in Central Park, which is obviously a kind of famous court. The really famous one in New York is in West 4th Street. But then there are also totally anonymous courts in small towns in Pennsylvania where you might find an interesting high school kid who's really got promise. Anyway, so it's just this wonderful way into the life of a city, which you can tap into even if you don't know anybody. You just show up at the court and try to get in a game.
I suspect that you've played a lot of that. In your youth, or because I know you played I think it's professional. You call it minor league basketball, I think, which you've written about.
I call it minor league. I mean, I was paid to do it, and most of my teammates were paid. I much preferred pickup basketball to organized basketball. I didn't like the team bus and the sweaty nylon uniforms and the referees. I didn't like any of that. I just like going with a couple of buddies to a local park, seeing who was there, and seeing if you were good enough to play.
But in terms then of Tom and him wanting to write this book about it, he thought it related to a lack of ambition.
Part of what's going on is that he feels a little removed from the America he grew up in, and it bugs him that he's made this very privileged life for his kids that he thinks has removed him from the kind of people he grew up amongst. And part of what happens when he decides not to go home after dropping off his daughter, it's not like he has a big plan. It just, a college buddy has reached out to him and needs his legal advice. He hasn't seen his brother in a while. And so instead of turning home after dropping her off, he decides to keep driving almost on a whim. But part of the idea is that he needs to get in touch with who he used to be. And that means old friends, college buddies, and the world of, I don't want to say ordinary Americans because I don't really know what that means, but a kind of a world of a little bit removed from the East Coast privilege in which he spent most of his adult life.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you've written then about basketball before. Is that different to what basketball is represented in some of your other novels? There's a famous scene in You Don't Have to Live Like This where Barack Obama plays a game of pickup basketball and he breaks the main character's nose. Or pickup basketball is always there. There's also professionalized basketball, the NBA. How, is this different than to other versions of basketball, I guess, that you've written about in other novels?
I think this is probably the most middle-aged version of it that I've ever written because I'm the most middle-aged now that I'm writing it. As I say, it's much more of a side note in the book. The book is mostly about his marriage and his kids. Part of what he's doing is not just dropping one daughter at university, but driving to California where his dad is buried, but his son is in grad school. So he's not really running away from family. He's just running from one part of his family to another. One of his college buddies who used to work in the NBA, which is the professional basketball league, has just lost his job because of complicated owner-club relationship things that have gone wrong. And Tom is a lawyer who deals with this sort of thing and was a consultant on the legal advice that was given to the club about how they should deal with some of the issues involved. So the basketball is not just about basketball, but it's about law. It's about his job. And it's about, it's one of the reasons that he decides to keep traveling because his pal in Denver wants to talk to him about some legal matters.
Well, maybe you can tell me then just a little bit more about the significance of that. Because this is fictionalized, isn't it? This isn't a real, unless it is, but I think it's a fictionalized thing that happens with the Denver Nuggets and the ownership.
Yeah, it's fictional. There's stuff that happens in the NBA that I drew on, but the specific case is made up. You can't really write about basketball in America if you're not going to write about race, because for whatever reason, and that in itself is part of a complicated history, most professional basketball players, a majority of them are African American. And so you have this world, and it's changing all the time. So I don't want to say that this is set in stone, but it seemed like an interesting pocket to look at if you wanted to talk about the complications of race. And that's part of what's going on here. Tom has a sense, which the book wants to challenge as his road trip goes on, that he's been pushed a little bit from the center of his own life. He's been suspended at work because he teaches a course on hate crime, and some of his students complained about the things he was talking about. And so rather than litigate it, his dean decided to put him on a kind of unpaid leave, which Tom resents. But it's also part of a general picture as he goes through America visiting old buddies, this feeling that they have that they've somehow been pushed aside a little bit, partly because of age, partly because shifts in culture, generational shift.
Feels a little bit different than to what happens with the owner of the Denver Nuggets.
Yes.
And there's a lot less sympathy for the owner of the Denver Nuggets. Yes. And this seems more like a systemic cultural issue.
Yeah, I think in Tom's case, he was just a lawyer consulting on what happened, but the owner of the Denver Nuggets has been accused of creating a racist and sexist workplace culture. Go into some details. It's really hard, and I'm sympathetic. It's hard, especially in America right now, to talk about things like hate crime in an academic atmosphere without at some point saying something which might cause reasonable offense. And it's also hard if you're a teacher just to make sure you say what you're saying in the way that you would like to write it down if you could, with all the power of editing at your disposal, because you're talking all the time. And so what happened to Tom is not supposed to be anything like the sort of allegations that were made against the owner of the Denver Nuggets. It's on a different level, though it's a part of the book that Tom's son accuses Tom of giving legal advice to somebody who he thinks should not have the sympathy of the law.
Either way, you write about race and ethnicity in America, and you don't seem afraid to go into it. You don't go into it as much, I guess, here than you have done in something like You Don't Have to Live Like This. But it seems like, even though we're sort of talking about cultures that don't permit talking about it, or not permit, but create an environment and atmosphere to speak about it, you've seemed to have done that within your novels.
I have. I mean, when I talk about it, I tend to talk about it through the lens of first-person narrators who are not me. And I think that's important. I mean, part of what you want to do when you write fiction is have the freedom to discuss uncomfortable subjects. And part of the reason fiction is so good at doing that is because everything is slightly ironized by the fact that you're dealing with characters. You're not trying to expound your own political views.
Tell you what, it's time for a quick break on the Rippling Pages. Do come back. I'm going to be talking more to Ben about his novel, The Rest of Our Lives. I'm going to be in conversation with Katerina Volkmer about her second novel, Calls May Be Recorded for Training and Monitoring Purposes. That's published by Indigo Press. Now, Katerina Volkmer is a name that you will know well. She published The Appointment with Fitzcarraldo Editions that went on to be translated into over 15 languages and was a debut novel hit. So I'm delighted to be in conversation with her. But Katerina was also one of the first authors that I ever interviewed on the Rippling Pages. So we're going to be doing this conversation live and in person at the Hyde Park Book Club in Leeds. That's on Monday, the 12th of May. If you're in the area or travelling from wherever you are, please do come along. There's a link to the tickets in the show notes. It's going to be a great event. The Hyde Park Book Club is a really fantastic, intimate, cosy venue. That means you've got to get your tickets soon. And as well as this, Next Chapter Books Leeds, the new independent bookshop in Leeds that's focusing on women's writing. They're going to be there too, selling books. It's going to be a great event. There's going to be, obviously, we're going to be chatting about Katerina's second novel. But also, there's, of course, the chance to ask Katerina some questions too. Hope to see you there. Welcome back to the Rippling Pages. I'm here with Benjamin Markovits. We're talking about The Rest of Our Lives. We're also talking a lot about basketball. But I guess we see more of Miri Doing because his son has already moved out by the time the novel starts. But Miri...
Yeah, he obviously loves both his kids. He has a slightly more complicated relationship with his older son, who challenges him in ways that his daughter doesn't. On the other hand, he also confides things to his son because he doesn't want to live a totally lonely life. And he's gotten to a point in his marriage where he and his wife, Amy, are not talking that much about things that matter. But he's scared at the beginning of the book because he adores his daughter and they have a great bantery relationship. And to some extent, he's relied on her during the pandemic and he's relied on her during the latter stages of his marriage to keep the family together, which is much too much pressure to put on her, which she's totally aware of. But she's leaving. He's dropping her off. She's going on with her own life. His wife is worried too. You spend 20 odd years of your marriage in the middle of a family. And if you do your job, the family doesn't need you anymore. The kids don't need you in the same way anymore. And you've got to adjust. And so part of the book is both of them trying to deal with the adjustment.
There's a sense of him having to confront, I don't know if it's confronting I think it is confronting his mortality at some point, but I don't know if you could just explain what is going on with Tom and his body.
Yeah. So, I mean, the truth is he had the same symptoms I had when I was writing the book. He went jogging one day and then it was suddenly like they pulled the energy supply, like they pulled some cord out of a socket and his legs wouldn't really go anywhere anymore. And he had to stop and walk it off for a few minutes. And then he ran on and other things like that kept happening to him. And this is what happened to me. And I gave him those symptoms when I was writing the novel before I knew what I had because the doctors couldn't diagnose anything. I thought for a while it was long COVID. And that's what Tom thinks it is. And in fact, so he goes on a road trip across America more or less on his own, but I went on a road trip across America with my family while these symptoms kept getting worse. And it turned out later that I figured out I had lymphoma. And that's what Tom is heading toward as the book progresses. Some realization that even though he's running away from something, the thing that he really needs to deal with is coming with him.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Ben. But his experiences your experiences then went into Tom's experiences.
It did, yeah. I just didn't know what I was writing into it because I didn't know what I had when I gave him the symptoms. For me, at first, I had this sense I wanted to write about a guy who felt like his life hadn't turned out the way he wanted it to, and the medical stuff might have been part of that picture, that his body was beginning to fail him. And so I gave him those symptoms thinking it fit thematically with the stuff I wanted to talk about. But then over the course of the period of writing the book, the symptoms deepened and got worse, uh, and I realized that I had to deal with it myself, and so it became a bigger and bigger part of the novel.
And that was all happening then when you were writing this. You were sort of
That all
discovering.
happened. I finished the book when
Wow,
I was going through chemo.
wow, wow. Okay. Well. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, what are the kind of feelings that you had to confront?
Well, I mean, the truth is I think the big difference it made to me was I had originally intended to leave Tom much more abandoned at the end of the book than I did. And that's partly because as soon as I knew what was wrong with me, as soon as I was really sick, of course, what happens is you feel yourself very much at the center of a lot of love. And I just didn't want to write the other version of it. It just didn't seem true to me. Because the problems that Tom and Amy had in their marriage were never based on a failure of love. And the difficulties that Tom had with his kids were never based on an absence of love. And so part of the effect of his figuring out what was wrong with him is to bring a lot of people to him at the end. So that changed how the book was written because it had changed my experience of the world.
Yeah, there is some, I don't know if reconciliation is the word, but the people come back into his life. He spent a lot of time on his own, hasn't he? And the people come back to his life, including his wife, Amy.
Yeah, when things that really matter to you happen, I think you start feeling the things that matter. And the truth is, my wife was totally amazing while I was going through chemo. She sat with me every hour in the chemo chair. There's a lot of admin that you have to deal with when you're sick, which I assume a lot of your listeners will know about. Just meetings with doctors, interpreting of information, dealing with medicines, and she did all of that. And there's also a kind of simplicity I felt to being sick, which I don't want to say it was a compensation for what I had to go through. But when all you're trying to do is stay alive, uh, in fact, you have a clear sense of the meaning of each day. And the routines become meaningful. Eating enough becomes meaningful. Going for a walk becomes meaningful. And the novel ends before Tom reaches all of that, but he's on the cusp.
How are you doing now?
So far as I know, I'm in remission. The doctors keep checking up on me.
They like to do that, don't
They do, yeah, and I'm grateful for it. I had really tremendous care. It's amazing. I spend some of my professional life trying to help people write better stories, and they spend their professional lives keeping people like me alive. So I was full of gratitude and admiration for them. A friend of mine works in narrative medicine.
they? Mm.
As soon as you spend a lot of time talking to doctors, you realize that part of what's going on is storytelling, and you need to find the right story to figure out what happened or what's happening. And doctors, no matter how many tests they run, still depend on the way you present whatever you're going through. And so I think in my case, part of what made it hard for me to get the diagnosis I needed is that long COVID was such a compelling narrative to explain a whole host of middle-aged symptoms. It just happened not to be the right one, but it meant that it took longer than it might otherwise could have done to figure out what was wrong with me. So I think my serious basketball playing days are probably done. But I'm 51 years old, so that I was headed in that direction anyway.
No new contract then for
No new contract. No,
oh
the
no.
Lakers haven't called me.
Have they not? That is, I think they've got another guy in that's.
They do. Yeah, they do.
Yeah, I think might be able to cover you for a bit, but
Yeah.
I just wondered if for our listeners who perhaps might have the similar ambitions to Tom, write their own book, whether it's about pickup basketball or not. But I think it just reflecting on your journey as a writer, where you maybe see it going now after this novel, and where it's kind of come from. Those novels, the days when you were sort of writing about Byron and the sign papers, different. It's a different
Yeah.
era of writing, isn't it? It feels like.
Yeah. So I think I mean, I wrote probably 3.5 historical novels, 3 about Byron. My first novel was partly historical fiction. And recently I've just been writing contemporary stuff. The truth is, I think it's hard to know what I will write next, but the part that strikes me as most enduring is the interest in family life. I like writing about family. Partly I like writing about the little things that shape our days and preoccupy us. And one of the challenges of that kind of writing is that it's sometimes hard to create a sense of high stakes, but that's what family life is for, because in the middle of family life, every little thing has roots in much deeper histories. And so if you want to write about the little interactions that shape people's lives, the family seems to me the place to do it in.
Some more families, maybe.
More families, yeah.
Um,
Probably more middle-aged too. I think on some level, what makes you write each book was a sense that you left some things out of the last book. And so that keeps pushing you along.
If you had one thing to say to that person who wrote the signed papers, what do you think you'd say?
I don't know. I have, when I dip into it, part of me, in the same way that if I watch my younger self play basketball, is envious of his imaginative energy, which I don't know that I have anymore. I think my prose is probably simplified a little bit, but I also was very, I remember writing the first few pages of the sign papers, which felt like a breakthrough because it was a voice a little closer to the voice that I actually use in speaking, which I hadn't written before. And to some extent, I've just tried to follow that direction. I try to write the kind of language that I could imagine saying. And I hope the rest of our lives feels like a book in which Tom's voice you could imagine across the dinner table, as opposed to the kind of writing which is the sort of the finely crafted particular writing that you can only come up with on the page.
Well, Ben, wherever it takes you next, I'm sure that I will be, watching. I'll be waiting for the next one. I'm sure many of our listeners will be too. But for now, this has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for giving up your time. The Rest of Our Lives is published by Faber and Faber, and it's out on the 25th of March. But for now, Benjamin, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.